Hello, and welcome to the John Evans podcast, where we talk about philosophy, psychology, movies, and other stuff. I'm thinking of renaming the podcast the Mad Spark Podcast to loosely affiliate it with a new film festival we're starting in 2026, which will be the Spark of Madness Film Festival. I'd have the filmmakers come on the podcast and talk about their movies and kind of defend the philosophy in their movies. More on that to come. That's kind of a work in progress, but I'm excited about it. Today's guest is Dr. Todd Shackelford. Dr. Shackelford is an evolutionary psychologist. He's a distinguished professor at Oakland University in Michigan, where he is currently serving as chair. He's an APA fellow and the editor-in-chief of the academic journals Evolutionary Psychology and Evolutionary Psychology Science. His research focuses on sexual psychology and behavior with a special focus on sexual conflict between men and women. Today, we talk about the testability of evolutionary hypotheses. We talk about sex differences in the workforce, in school, and in society more generally. We talk about whether he thinks we evolved to be monogamous. We talk about the male gaze and the female display. We talk about mate preferences and a bunch of other stuff. It was a lot of fun. So without further ado, here is Dr. Todd Shackelford. Dr. Shackelford, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, John.
So you're an evolutionary psychologist. Can you give me a brief description of what evolutionary psychology is?
Sure. So evolutionary psychology is really, what it boils down to is the application of Darwinian principles of natural and sexual selection to human information processing. It's psychology informed by, our ancestral history and the sorts of adaptive problems that our ancestors are likely to have currently faced and solved in terms of survival and reproduction.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I want to talk just at the beginning about kind of the criticism about evolutionary psychology that I hear all the time, and kind of what the modern counter argument is to that, which is the testability critique. So it seems to me that evolutionary psychology, we have two types of hypotheses, in my opinion. One seems kind of testable and one seems maybe less testable, arguably. So the testable hypothesis is usually something like men and women cheat and women cheat because they want a mate switch or something like that. You can go out and you can see if the women that cheat, if they're mate switching more often, you can kind of observe that and it's testable. But I think the less testable hypothesis is something like women evolved to cheat, and it's hard to actually go out and pin down and experiment to test the evolutionary mechanisms involved in that evolution, because it could be something like sociocultural reasons, right? And you can't really say, well, it was because of the sociocultural reasons or it was because of evolution. So what's kind of is that problematic, that testability, or what's kind of the counter argument to that critique?
Yeah, I think the testability issue is really what it reflects more is a misunderstanding of sort of the way science operates. Evolutionary psychologists are not testing the theory of evolution by natural selection. That's been done, for 100 years and thousands of studies. So, the issue is not, did human psychology evolve? We know it did. There is no alternative. There's no scientific alternative. In other words, you could be a creationist, but I'm not sure that really does you any good in terms of, the explanatory value. So we don't test whether or not human psychology evolved. What we do is we test the various design features of purported or hypothesized adaptations that comprise human psychology. And, if you're looking at something like sex differences, absolutely, you would want to, you might have a hypothesis that, your example of, why men and women, are unfaithful to their partners. One hypothesis might be related to acquisition of good genes, for example. But I think it would be fair to say, well, wait a minute, you've only tested this hypothesis in Western samples. Might you want to also collect data in non-Western samples to document that it's not something peculiar to Western samples? And you would want to do that. You'd want to document that that you would find. I've just thought about the mate preferences work. That was some of the initial criticism on the mate preferences work. That men more than women value physical attractiveness in youth. Women more than men value resource acquisition and, good financial standing. And it was initially documented by Buss in in the United States. And so then he basically, he received a lot of criticism that he didn't collect data from, various other places in the world. And so he had a whole slew of psychologists and sociologists predict to him beforehand what they might expect. And of course, many of them expected wild differences across different cultures. Buss did not, because he was, using the theory of parental investment and sexual selection. He predicted that you'd find the same thing everywhere around the world. And that's basically what he found. And there was no single culture. There wasn't a culture where women value physical attractiveness in youth more than do men. But we didn't know that until it was tested. So you would want to do the relevant tests. Evolutionary psychology, not as I see it, evolutionary psychology is a normal paradigm science. I mean, you basically generate hypotheses. Those hypotheses are used to generate predictions. Those predictions are then tested with empirical data. And if you can't test a hypothesis, there's no way to test it, then it's a terrible hypothesis, whether it's an evolutionary hypothesis or, a non-evolutionary hypothesis, whatever that would be.
Yeah. So if something like, okay, you have an evolutionary psychologist who's like, they both agree that women prefer taller men, just for an example. But one says, oh, okay, I think women prefer taller men because they were able to get more fruit out of the trees back in the caveman days or something. The other one's like, no, I think they prefer taller men because they were able to fight off more predators or something. So they just have competing hypotheses. Is there a way to test for that aspect, or are we really only able to test for like more of the social relationship psychology stuff where we're like, we can go out and look at mate preferences?
No, I mean, you can test. I guess I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, if they have competing hypotheses about like why a trait evolved,
Sure.
where do the two evolutionary psychologists go from there? Like if they can't kind of run an experiment to figure out which one of them is right.
Well, then those would not be good hypotheses. If you can't make unique predictions that provide you the opportunity to, rule out alternatives, well, then what are you doing? I mean, then to me, that seems like there's a problem with the way that, the hypotheses have been, produced or generated. So in other words, what you would want to do is you'd want to identify specific features of those hypotheses that could be pitted against one another, and for which empirical data would be the arbiter, would be the decider. So I'm just thinking about, I'm thinking about how to, at any rate, bottom line is you'd want to, I was trying to do something with your particular example. But I think you would want to, neither would have the quote upper hand if neither can generate, testable predictions that the other cannot generate. I mean, you want that ultimately what you want to have if you have, two evolutionary psychologists, and each one of them thinks they're right. Well, then what needs to happen is they need to generate hypotheses that can be tested and for which only one of them could be correct, given the background theory.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Because all the examples I was coming up with it. So yeah, if you can't form an experiment and actually test for that, then it doesn't sound like evolutionary psychologists are coming up with those types of hypotheses then. So I can pivot at this point away from the criticism of evolutionary psychology and actually focus on maybe what evolutionary psychology is doing. So my first question is, how is a discipline so interested in sex differences, navigating the current cultural idea of gender and gender not being necessarily sex-based or even binary?
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's affected anything that I do or anything that anybody I know does. I mean, we know there are two sexes. There's no question about it. I mean, it's just, it's like saying, the idea that there's more than two sexes is on the same order as the earth is flat. So, I mean, it hasn't affected anything I do. and nor do I spend any time other than sort of, chuckling at some of the foolishness that I hear.
Do evolutionary psychologists, are any that you know of, doing research on gender fluidity and that kind of new modern idea?
No, nobody takes it seriously. Nobody I know. No, I mean, that's the honest answer. I don't know anybody who's doing that. I just, it's not taken seriously by people in the evolutionary biological science community. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because you see, like you listen to Sam, of course, Sam Harris is always going on about this, but it's crazy to see magazines like Science kind of bending and saying, people born with vaginas instead of just saying, female sex or something. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it seems to be having an effect on the science, but I can see how it's just not having any effect on anyone researching sex differences because, nobody, yeah, I'm with you that there's only two sexes. I can see somebody making an argument that that gender's a different bear, but
Yes, I could see that as well. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that that's a separate issue is, I certainly there's utility in assessing things like masculinity, femininity. Um, I mean, if by gender fluidity, you mean, the fact that some males are more masculine, some females are more masculine. I mean, there are variations. I mean, there's no doubt that there's very good evidence that that's the case. So one can be biologically male, but have, a variety of different traits that are uh, more commonly ascribed to females. But that's a separate issue from whether or not there are or there are more than two sexes. So gender, I think there is something, there is a real concept, and it's a useful concept to talk about gender in terms of, you know, uh, ascription of particular traits or display of particular traits. I mean, certainly there's variation, but that's an entirely independent, issue from biological sex, which is defined as, the size of gametes.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, it makes sense to me. So I want to talk next about kind of a huge debate in Western countries right now about sex differences and equal opportunity versus kind of equal outcomes or equity. So things like the wage gap or the CEO gap, you'll see one side pointing to men and saying, "Well, look at all these men. They're all the president, or all the presidents are. The president is always a man, and more CEOs are men." And then on the other side, you'll see people point to, yeah, but men are homeless more often, men are murdered more often, men are murderers more often, right? So men are more likely to be in the position of the United Healthcare CEO and Luigi, right? So does evolutionary psychology have anything to say about these differentials between men and women, why these differentials exist, and what we should what we should do about them, like is and ought? I'm not sure if evolutionary psychology makes ought arguments, but thought I'd ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think right. I mean, the males and females, the sexes do differ in a variety of different ways, and you're right that there is greater variation in a huge range of traits. There's greater variation in men than there is in women, but that's true across species. That's true for all primates. It's true for all mammals, and so humans aren't unique in that sense. There are more, among males, for example, in humans. Yes, there are more men at the super high end of IQ, for example, than there are women. But there are also more men at the super low end of IQ than is true for women. Uh, but again, on any trait of any value, that is that people or that mates select on, for example, you find that the distribution of that trait for men or males is generally more spread out than it is for females. And so, the explanation. I mean, hasn't been sufficiently explained, you know, broadly from an evolutionary biological perspective, but it wouldn't be anything peculiar to humans. Um, I mean, people have talked about it, and there's one there's a woman, a biologist, a philosopher, biologist called Helena Cronin, and she's written on this. And she makes reference to among males, there are more Nobels, but also more dumbbells. The bell curve is such that there are many men. Yeah, so there are very few men at the upper end, and there are very few men at the lower end. Also true for women if you look at women's curve, but this spread is a little bit more extended. So that there are more men that score very high than is true for women, but there are also more men that score very low than is true for women. Yeah, so there's the fact of the distribution in terms of the traits. You asked a number of different things. So there is good evidence that men are more status striving than are women. They're more interested in pursuit of, greater access to resources, on average. So men are more status striving, more resource striving. Again, on average, it's not to suggest that there aren't some women who are more status striving than most men. That's also true. But there is an average sex difference. There are also average sex differences in a variety of other traits. So in terms of, equal opportunity, sure. I think a separate issue, but no, evolutionary psychology per se doesn't say anything about what we should do. And evolutionary psychology is, like any other, scientific perspective. It can help us identify what is. And then a separate issue is what ought to be. And I think, certainly, there's no reason I can think of that people with exactly the same, qualifications shouldn't be receiving the same pay. They have the same qualifications, the same, mathematical skill or whatever it is. Well, then they ought to be paid the same. I think we've clearly made great strides. My understanding is that there's very little, if any, wage gap once you control for, variety of demographic variables, number of children, marital status. Once you equalize along the relevant variables, that my understanding is that there's very little wage gap any longer. But I'm open to the data.
So why do we think that men evolved to be more status driven? Do you think it's just men have to compete differently for mates than do women? I'm sure women have to compete in their own ways, but yeah, why do we think that men are more status driven?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's not just status driving. It's part of it is status driving. Men have evolved, as have males in all sexually reproduced, or the vast majority of sexually reproducing species, to best competitors in order to be selected as partners. And I think men, there's lots of work suggesting that men are more risk taking than are women. They're more likely to take risks in order to, secure status, reputation, prestige. Why would they do this? Because these are the qualities along which women are likely to select them as mates. And that you see males in the majority of sexually reproducing species behaving more risky, taking more chances. It doesn't require sort of conscious effort. It's just that males are playing a strategy where they can be one of a few winners in the reproductive game, or they can be, one of the, much greater number of losers in the reproductive game. Whereas for women or females, they're all but guaranteed to, reproduce. The game is more risky and more probabilistic for males. So our ancestors are those men who did take chances, who did, behave in ways that were more likely to result in greater status and reputation. And as a consequence, they were more likely to be selected as mates. They had more offspring, and the genes that built those status acquisition mechanisms were then passed on with greater frequency to their offspring. And so, we can complain about it, but it is what it is. Male psychology on average is simply more geared towards acquisition of status, resources, reputation, and is motivated to take the chances and the risks that lead to, or at least probabilistically led over evolutionary history to greater status, reputation, and prestige.
That all makes sense. I wanted to talk to you about another kind of discrepancy right now about school performance. I'm not sure if any evolutionary psychologists are doing research on this, but the big thing right now is you see books coming out like about boys and men not performing as well in school. Do you think it's that men and boys evolved it in such a way that they just find it harder to focus in school? Because I think IQ, when you look at IQ growing up, I haven't seen a difference in average IQ between boys and girls. And so that kind of makes me think that it comes down to studying and just being able to focus in the classroom, maybe motivation. So are there any evolutionary psychologists doing work on why boys aren't doing as well in school right now?
That's a great question. There are two evolutionary developmental psychologists that I'm aware of that I'm not certain that they've done work on sex differences in school performance, but I would be very surprised if they haven't published such work. And these scholars are David Bjorklund, who's at Florida Atlantic University, and David Geary, who's at the University of Missouri at Columbia. And yes, I think that's my read of the literature too. That there's no sex difference in IQ or cognitive ability that would account for boys and men's generally poor performance. It's not a huge difference, but it's there. You have to put that alongside the fact that there are more men who are scoring as so-called geniuses, and there are men who, there are more men at the far upper ends of educational performance than there are women. But there are also more men, of course, at the far lower ends of educational performance and failure, basically. I believe, that's, I don't know this literature well, but my sense is that that boys relative to girls are, less attentive, less motivated to, please the teacher, to do well in academics. They seem to be certainly they're overrepresented among children diagnosed with ADD and ADHD. It's not that there aren't any girls diagnosed that way. Of course there are, but there is a sex difference there as well. And that may well be part of the explanation. I think it's a good question. I think it's an interesting area for research.
Yeah, as someone who has a son and a daughter, I can tell that I can tell my son's going to struggle more in school, but I can tell he's a smart kid. So I really think that it's kind of a motivational issue. I don't think he has an interest issue. Like my girl has always been interested in reading and learning, and even though my son's super smart, he just doesn't want to sit down and read books. He wants to go out and play in the backyard or something. So
Right.
yeah, I just think that'll be interesting when that kind of more of that research comes out to kind of explain that, if it's a motivational thing or what it is. So I can pivot at this point to another topic, which is monogamy. And do you think that human beings evolved to be monogamous, or is it more complicated than that? Is it more like it works like? Well, I'll just ask you. Yeah, do you think human beings evolved to be monogamous in long-term relationships?
Well, yeah, it is a complicated question, and I mean, most humans around the world, for all of recorded history, have been monogamous. That is, socially monogamous. Males and females pairing up and, effectively breeding together over multiple seasons. But again, social monogamy should be distinguished from genetic monogamy. I mean, we know that males and females in committed long-term relationships also occasionally are unfaithful to one another. And therefore, while they may be socially monogamous, They're not genetically monogamous. So males can produce children outside of a long-term mateship. Females can cuckold males. They can produce a child, with their social partner, who's not sired by that partner, but is fed by a different man. So, I think the best case can be made that human psychology evolved uh, to, well, yes, to motivate socially monogamous relationships. Um, I think both males and females have, you know, evolved psychology that motivates long-term mating, and it evolves psychology that motivates short-term mating. Under different circumstances. And I don't think it's, necessarily one or the other, but when you look at what most people are doing most of the time in most places for most of history, it's social monogamy. It's being involved in a long-term mateship that lasts a certain amount of time, and it may dissolve, and people often will remate. Um, but a separate issue is, what do men and women desire? I mean, I think there clearly are sex differences in what men and women desire. I mean, men being far more desirous and interested in short-term mating, women far more interested and desirous of long-term mating. And it's, there's, depending on, various ecological variables, you can see men, quote, winning, and you see more short-term mating. And then in other cases, you can see women winning, and, you see more long-term mating. There's a lot of work on sex ratio, for example, the number of reproductive age males to reproductive age females in a local population. And that seems to have an effect on mating psychology. So, all of which to say, the default mating strategy seems to be social monogamy, but both men and women are capable of, long-term mating, while also, simultaneously pursuing short-term mates, sometimes even long-term mates. So having two long-term mates.
So, cheating is a fascinating subject. I think I've heard you say on other podcasts that men cheat based mostly on opportunity, right? Like that's the biggest variable that predicts men's cheating almost. So when women cheat, do we know why a woman would cheat to maybe cuckold her husband versus why a woman would cheat to maybe mate switch? Because I've heard kind of competing hypotheses there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are multiple hypotheses, some of which may be competing. I think what we're learning now, I think the state of the field now in terms of female infidelity is that there are likely to be many, reasons why females are occasionally unfaithful. And I think part of it could be, one possibility is that they are attempting to secure genes, for subsequent offspring that are better than the genes that would have been provided by their long-term partner. So that they can simultaneously secure resources from a long-term partner while securing so-called better genes from an alternative man. I mean, that's one possibility. I think mate switching is also a possibility, and it may be that these are all viable hypotheses, under different circumstances, under different conditions, depending on the qualities of the woman, the quality of her long-term partner. I think men's infidelity is far more straightforward. Like I said, there is a lot of work suggesting that the greatest predictor of male infidelity is flat out. It's just sheer opportunity. That doesn't predict female infidelity at all, because females always have that opportunity. And that speaks to the sex difference in desirability as a prospective partner. I mean, women hold the power in that sense.
Yeah. Do you think there's maybe an element of a benefit of genetic diversity? So a woman might not necessarily even need to have or want better genes from another prospective partner, but just having a greater diversity of genes in offspring is maybe kind of like a good diversification strategy, like a good investment strategy to not put all your eggs in one basket?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, each one of these hypotheses have been tested and have been, you know, and their data consistent with each one of these hypotheses, switching, better genes, good genes, genetic variability in other species. I mean, so it would be strange indeed if it was not the case in humans, that there weren't multiple reasons why females, pursued extra pair populations. But certainly, I think that is a viable hypothesis. I mean, that would be a better hypothesis in circumstances in which, the parasite pathogen load was a lot higher, for example. In ecologies or in environments where the parasite load or the pathogen load was higher, you might expect females to be more likely to pursue extra populations for purposes of diversifying the genetic, makeup of her offspring. Given that diversification is what, throws a stick into the wheel of parasite success. But I don't know of any data specifically on that issue. There is a book called Why Women Cheat. I think it's called Why Women Cheat. No, it's called Why Women Have Sex. But they also address in the context. This is David Buss and one of his colleagues, Cindy Meston. They address why women have sex, and of course, sometimes women have sex in the context of cheating. And so they address all these competing hypotheses in that book. So it's a nice summary of what we knew a few years ago.
Do men and women still cheat at similar rates, or is there kind of a discrepancy between emotional versus physical cheating? I know there's a preference difference between emotional versus physical cheating. I know men would prefer a woman cheat emotionally and vice versa for women. But yeah, are the rates still about 50-50?
They're very close. I mean, it's always, of course, this is the question. It just reminded me that in the Kinsey research, the work done by the Kinsey group, this was the most commonly skipped question, was the questions regarding infidelity. And it is difficult to get straight answers sometimes, and because people are concerned. I mean, they don't want their answers revealed. They don't want their partners to find out. But all that said, there are multiple ways you can get at the issue of infidelity. And I think the best evidence suggests that somewhere around 30% of men at some point in their marriage or long-term committed relationship are unfaithful. Typically, that the definition is sexual infidelity. And by comparison, something around 25% of women are unfaithful at some point in their marriage, sexually unfaithful. Now, the issue of emotional infidelity, I don't know that anyone's specifically pulled apart sexual and emotional infidelity and then attempted to get at the rates. But my guess is it's probably somewhere similar. It seems like men are ever so slightly more likely to be unfaithful than are women, but not by a lot.
Yeah, that's good to know. I didn't know that 30% of that's a pretty big number for 25% of women and 30% of men cheat in their marriage. That's kind of depressing.
Yeah, I mean, at some point in the marriage. Well, if you look at, I mean, of course, that's at any point, at some point in the marriage. If you look at by year, so in a given year, it's of course a much smaller number. It might be, I don't know what it is, but let's say 5 or 7% in any given year. But overall, if you just ask the question about have you ever been unfaithful, then something like 25% of women and 30% of men report that yes, they have.
So I want to talk next about the male gaze, which is a big topical thing. And the male gaze, as I see it, is just men checking out the people they're sexually interested in, mostly women. But I wanted to ask is if there's something that I'm calling the female display, and if there's also a female gaze and a male display. So the male gaze, it's always just men checking out like the physical body of mostly women. And you could argue there's a female gaze where they're kind of assessing maybe the resources of men or something like that. And the female display, maybe they put on more kind of overtly physically sexual displays to attract mates. And men maybe are trying to drive sports cars. Like, is there kind of, are there kind of equivalents here for the male gaze, the female gaze, a female display and a male display?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of work in a field that usually is referred to as human ethology, which looks at the behavioral sort of displays that men and women use to communicate interest, sexual interest, or interest in getting to know that person more. And so there's a lot of work. Just thinking about Eibel Eibsfeld. There's other. This is sort of classic human ethology work where they'll film women and men interacting, and then they can document that hair flipping, for example, or turning one's head to the side is something that women are more likely to do as an indication of sexual interest. Smiling, of course, is something that both men and women are more likely to do, but particularly women when they're interested in pursuing someone as a prospective partner. I don't know that they've made a lot of distinction between short-term mating and long-term mating, but certainly there is work that would be the equivalent of male gaze. I mean, male gaze isn't all that revealing, other than it suggests that the man is sexually interested in that woman. But that's a much more frequent sort of occurrence than is women's display of sexual or romantic interest in a male. I mean, by which I mean, the short answer is that there is work on both male and female signals of interest. I think the work seems to be richer and arguably more interesting as it pertains to women's displays, because they are less frequent and therefore more informative than our men's gaze displays.
Yeah. Something that I think might fall into maybe the female gaze. Do women still want men to make more money than them? And does that negatively affect their dating prospects if women are high earners?
Well, bottom line is, yes. I mean, there is work explicitly on this, and women who make more money simply up the ante. And now they want their partner to make even more money. And so, no, it doesn't seem to negatively affect, it doesn't reduce, it does, but it's a self-imposed reduction of mate pool. I mean, women who make a lot of money demand a partner, on average, who makes more than they do. It doesn't change whether they're making $5 an hour or $20,000 an hour. The women simply up the ante by their own reports.
Yeah, and does that? I wonder if that would contribute to any sort of wage gap, having that demand out there for men to make more money. It's kind of a supply and demand. If men feel that pressure that they always have to make more money, maybe they're gonna maybe that factors into that status drive.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And to the extent that there is a wage gap, part of the explanation surely is that women demand, by their own reports, women demand resources, access to resources, good financial prospects. And so given that men's sexual access to women's reproductive, potential turns on whether or not they're selected, perhaps we shouldn't be shocked that men are frantically attempting to, secure status, resources, and higher pay.
Right. Something I heard another evolutionary psychologist talking about is kind of life satisfaction or being content with your accomplishments, and why in kind of modern society it's really hard, especially for status-driven men, to just be content with what you've accomplished or to be happy with what you've accomplished. And I've heard the argument that that's an evolved trait, because if you're perpetually unhappy, you're going to go out and try to accomplish more, as opposed to if you're satisfied with your accomplishments and resting on your laurels, you're kind of just, you're not going to maybe achieve as much in the long run. Do you agree with that? Have you done work with that directly?
I have not done work directly on that. I do agree with that. I think that, male psychology and female psychology, I think well, put it this way, our ancestors are likely to have been those men and women who were not satisfied. Not that they were, crushingly depressed, but they were just not satisfied. They wanted more, because wanting more is the first step to getting more. And so, our ancestors are not those men and women who basically said, well, there you have it. I've done what I wanted to do and just sat back, because they would have been, lapped, by those men and women, our ancestors, who wanted more. And so I think there is something to be said for, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I think male psychology in particular, but certainly female psychology as well, is, sort of built to motivate relentless pursuit of more. And it's very difficult for most people. It's very difficult for people to be satisfied with what they have.
Do you think that women, since they're expecting their men to make more money, that women are often less satisfied with their male partner's accomplishments, and that's an evolved trait to kind of push men? And I'm not sure if men have that same kind of drive with their female partners.
Right. I think there clearly is a sex difference in, interest in partner pursuing additional status, resources, prestige. Men being less interested in their partner's status, prestige, and reputation than are women's. I mean, there's a lot of work on that. But yeah, I mean, are women going to be? The question is, are women more likely to be less satisfied with their partner's status, prestige, and income than are men themselves? And that I don't know the answer to. That might well be a predictor of women's mate value. Women who are higher in mate value than their partners may be more sensitive to his failings when it comes to status, resources, and, prestige.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One other thing I'll add is that, there's some interesting work done by a woman called Laura Betzig, who is an evolutionary anthropologist, on divorce. And she looked at reasons for divorce across 160 cultures. And the number one reason, or one of the top reasons, it might be the number one or number two reason that women divorce their husbands, is failure to secure resources or losing a job. That's way down the list for men. That's for men, the number one reason is partner's infidelity.
Yeah. I think that says something. So I saw you also do an episode I saw a lot of your episodes on The Dissenter, and I really like that podcast, and I really like what you had to say on that podcast. You've been on there a few times, it looked like. And then one episode was based on sex after having children in a marriage or a long-term relationship. So what are some of the reasons why the female sex drive might decline after having children in a long-term relationship? What are kind of the evolutionary reasons?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Depends on if you mean immediately after, or there is work on female mate preferences while prior to having children, and then once a woman does have children. And a lot of that work has looked at women who are actively on the so-called mating market, and women with children have, by multiple measures, have lower mate value because they're now dragging around, these 2 kids or 3 kids or whatever it is. And so they're less attractive as a prospective mate, maybe not as a prospective short-term mate, but certainly as a prospective long-term mate. And so one of the things that my spouse, Viviana Shackelford, and some of her students have done is to look at, and other people have done this. I think there's a couple of other people in this area, but not that many. They've looked at whether or not women are more, so women who are pursuing mates who they already have children, we might anticipate that they would be a little more sensitive to, the kindness and caring, sort of qualities of a prospective male, given the risks of abuse of their children from a previous mateship. And there is some work to suggest that's the case. So in other words, that might be one domain in which you might anticipate kindness, caring, interest in children might be a little bit higher for women's assessments of prospective mates, after they have children, as opposed to before they have children.
Yeah. Do you think, I had a couple evolutionary maybe explanations here I thought I'd throw past you. Do you think that there might be an evolved trait in women if they're in a long-term relationship and they just had kids and they see a reduction in sex drive, that there's something evolved there because they don't want to have too many kids too fast, and that might spread their parental resources too thin?
Yes, I think there is something to that. I think, of course, breastfeeding does reduce the likelihood of conception. Um, but I think also, the disinterest in sex, for a period of time, part of the explanation might be, sort of a strategy for reducing the likelihood of producing yet another offspring so soon after having just had one. I don't know of any work explicitly on that, but I think that's an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah, I thought that would be maybe a factor. I thought also maybe that genetic diversification theory might come into play where, you've already got these genes with a couple kids or whatever. And so if continuing to have more kids might be, taking a riskier bet, putting all your eggs in one basket. And so maybe that reduction in sex drive might um, kind of mitigate the risk. But then I guess you would see probably an uptick in mate switch and infidelity if that were the case.
Right. And I'm not sure we do see that. I mean, what you see is a generalized disinterest in sex. You don't see, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any work suggesting that women who have recently had children become, that they report an increase in sex with, an extra pair male. I'm not, I would be very surprised if that were true, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. That'd be interesting. So I'll pivot at this point. I have a few more questions here. Why do you think evolutionary psychology, even on their Wikipedia page, is being associated with the right wing? Like I can tell, um, I mean, I hate to say just like focusing on two sexes, or sex differences is the reason. But yeah, why do you think that there's that association with the right wing, that some people on the left are associating with the right wing?
I, you know, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I mean, all the work I'm familiar with looking at political alignment, political interests, documents clearly that evolutionary psychologists are super left, super liberal, progressively liberal. And there's work, recent paper published in a journal called Human Nature, where they explicitly ask this question. And I think realizing, bottom line is they asked this question and they found that evolutionary psychologists are no different than most academics. I mean, they're very left leaning, very liberal, very even progressively liberal. So, I mean, why do people? I mean, I certainly am aware. I haven't heard that in a while, but I don't know. Yeah, it seems to be maybe it's a way to sort of paint, people who look at sex differences as just a bunch of fanatical right wingers. So you could write off those results, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it's just no truth in it. I mean, it's in fact the data suggests precisely the opposite. That evolutionary psychologists are quite left leaning, actually.
Yeah, I could see how people on the right might abuse the research and say, well, women evolved to not make as much money, and maybe make an argument that women shouldn't be in positions of power because men evolved are more status driven. But again, that's abuse of the research. That's not, the research itself, right?
Yes, yeah, that's confusing. Is with art. I mean, we also know that the human psychology evolved to uh, decrease investment in genetically unrelated offspring or genetically unrelated, uh, let's think step offspring, for example. But that doesn't mean we therefore should just allow it to run its course.
Right. So my next topic was individual differences, and I've heard that individual differences is kind of, I don't know if it's a problem for evolutionary psychology, but it's at least something that evolutionary psychology maybe needs to dig into more? Do you think individual differences has it not been kind of explained properly yet by evolutionary psychology?
Um, well, I think the history of evolutionary psychology certainly has been a focus. I mean, you can sort of think of 3 levels of analysis. There's the human nature level of analysis, how all humans are the same. Then there's the sex differences or group differences level of analysis, how men and women are sometimes occasionally different, depending on different uh, you know recurrent adaptive problems. Or it could be differences as a function of age. There are also expectations about age differences. And then there's the level of individual differences, how, any given, in a group of men, why there are differences, why there are, robust, replicable individual differences. And I think it's true that historically, evolutionary psychologists have been more focused on human nature and group differences, notably sex differences, and less focused on individual differences. And I think it's just a matter of, you know, uh, low hanging fruit. First, you tackle human nature, then you can tackle sex differences, then you can, uh, you know, then perhaps becomes, more interesting perhaps to look at individual differences. So there are evolutionary psychologists who are investigating individual differences. I think it can be more difficult, I suppose. But I think you're right that it is an area where, evolutionary psychology seems to be, much richer, sort of field, to sort of dig into. But I think it's an interesting and important field. I think there are important individual differences that we should want to explain and understand.
Yeah. So if I think about something like personality, um, it seems like you'd have to almost come up with different evolutionary histories to explain something like extroversion and introversion. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Like it seems you should be able to say, well, here's some evolutionary reasons why somebody might be extroverted. It gets you this more resources, blah blah blah. Introversion, the evolutionary reasons for that might be something like you're safer because you don't go out as much. So maybe people who evolved more like around predators or something, where the introverts are the descendants of people who evolved around more lions or something. So does it seem like you just have to have multiple evolutionary explanations for kind of the different individual differences like extroversion and introversion?
I mean, perhaps, but I think, you know, one way in which evolutionary psychologists have thought about personality differences, individual differences in personality traits, is that there are different ways to move through life as a human. Uh, One way is to be extroverted. Another way is to be introverted. There are benefits and costs to both traits, and it may actually be that we inherit the traits that we inherit, and then from there, our evolving psychology, our psychology that's built developmentally, sort of is sensitive to the likely traits that we're going to display. And so part of it may be that individual humans are sort of self-assessing, where they stand on introversion or extroversion, and then modifying, their social strategies accordingly. So maybe that there is going to be variation there, and that part of the relevant evolved psychology is building social navigational, skills with those traits in mind. There are others who argue that just to taint it extremely, that individual differences are not all that interesting. They're blips, here or there, and they aren't anything we need to, spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, I guess I'd push back on that. I think personality research is interesting, but I guess maybe not, maybe less so from an evolutionary perspective. I'm not sure. I guess I'd have to see why those people don't. Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a lot to be gained even from personality research. But I guess they probably wouldn't discredit all of personality research. They would just say that it's not fruitful to go at it from an evolutionary perspective. Is that what you think they're saying?
Uh, they think that they might argue that that's, of course, there's variation, but we need not make a mountain out of a molehill. There's nothing to write home about. I think that strikes me as, sort of a give up even before you started attitude. I believe that, that the evidence suggests that there is important, you know, uh, there are important individual differences that are worth exploring from an evolutionary perspective and trying to understand why, people seem to display and different, sets of personality traits, and how that might figure into different social strategies. I think it's a very interesting topic.
So, kind of my last topic, or last two topics, maybe. I'm curious about religion and why people may have evolved to be religious. What are kind of the evolution? What's the evolutionary explanation for why people are religious? You teach a class on this still, is that right?
I have taught a class I teach an undergraduate course called Evolution, Science, and Superstition. Then I also have taught a graduate course on the evolutionary psychology of religion. And there are multiple explanations, multiple hypotheses multiple evolutionary hypotheses for why people universally have religious beliefs, why they express religious behaviors. And so, I think you'd have to grab a hold of, a particular facet of religion or religious behaviors and then go from there. Um, I think, some of them, I think there's some very interesting work within, generally it's known as the cognitive science of religion. And this is work that suggests that, belief in a supernatural being is sort of to be expected with a psychology that includes what some have referred to as a hyperactive agency detection device. Um, part of our part of our evolution is, we're an intensely social species, and there are huge benefits, or ancestrally, there were huge benefits to being able to predict and accurately anticipate your social partner's behaviors. What are they thinking? What do they want? What do they desire? And so that kind of, sort of promiscuous, sort of social navigational sort of mind reading lends itself, according to this explanation, to supernatural beliefs as a byproduct. Because when you can't explain something, you sort of just chalk it up to that unseen force. We see agency in, all over the place. We sometimes treat our cars or our phones as if they have agency, as if they have wishes and dreams and desires. And it's just it's a very small step to, building, more formal religions around, Jesus or Muhammad or any of the other religious figures. So, yeah, that's not to say there aren't benefits in terms of, group level benefits. So, to the extent that there's, widespread belief in a particular religious system, that may well improve the functioning of the group and may lend to, greater likelihoods of success in intergroup rivalries and so forth. But I think that would be incidental to the selection at the level of the gene, or the level of the individual, anyways. That I think is what needs to be explained, is why the human mind is built in such a way that it motivates beliefs that are patently false.
That actually brings me to kind of my next question, but it kind of ties in. I did a study in school, very informal, so I wouldn't even call it a study, but looking at religiosity and susceptibility to conspiracy theory. So do you think there's any overlap there? And why does the human mind seem to be more susceptible to believing things like a conspiracy theory, while at the same time also being maybe prone to being more religious?
Yes, I'm aware of work suggesting that people who report to be more religious are in fact more likely to be, they're more susceptible to conspiracy theories. I think it depends on the particular domain. But we actually did work on, I had a student who did some work on, it was using virtual reality. And basically people who were more religious, who reported being more religious, were also more likely to see things in a virtual environment that weren't there. They are more likely to say they did see. It was in a Slender Man game. And so they were pushing the button more frequently saying that they see Slender Man. People who reported to be more religious. Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. I think, yes, I think generally there seems to be correlations between, susceptibility to religious beliefs, susceptibility to, seeing things that aren't there. There's, that may be just a byproduct of a mind that is, more susceptible to religion. But, well, at any rate, that's not to say that it's therefore ancestrally would have been better to not be religious. I think the evidence suggests otherwise.
I think with conspiracy theory, I guess this isn't really an evolutionary idea, but it just seems like people, it makes them maybe like the hero in their mind in a more interesting story. So it seems like a way of coping with maybe the absurdity of life and how there might, maybe a lack of meaning. And so if you believe this conspiracy theory, all of a sudden you're like this person who has this secret knowledge, and you're on the right side of history, and you're part of a battle. And I think that's really similar to religion, where it does make you, you have the bad guy, you have you have pure evil like Satan or something, and it just creates this. It makes you a more interesting character, and it makes the story of your life more interesting. It's kind of how I see it.
Yes, I think that's, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then furthermore, I think there's something to be said for the benefits of believing what other people around you believe.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Well, that's actually all the questions I had. So I think we're going to get out a little early today. But I really appreciate you sitting down and talking with me. I had a lot of fun. And I hope to talk to you again in the future when I come up with a bunch of other random ideas that I want to ask you about. So yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Shackelford. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Thank you.